Okay, so I'm Christian Preus. I'm pastor at Mount Hope Lutheran Church, and we have a classical school that we've had for about 20 years where we teach Latin. A little bit of my background. I've been teaching Latin at the college level for about 10 years at University of Iowa, then University of Indiana, Purdue University in Fort Wayne as I went to seminary. And I've also taught Latin to children a number of times. So I've had a little experience with that, though it was daunting coming to a classical school and seeing the curriculum and seeing how do we best do this, right? How do we best teach this language? But I am convinced that the Latin must be an integral part of a classical education and not simply an add-on. Let me just give you a little anecdote. When I was finishing up I think it was the fall semester of my senior year in college, I had a professor at the University of North Dakota, Dr. Weinstein, which is actually Weinstein. I mean, you can't do that, right? So it's like this. You can't go Weinstein, right? That's because, you just can't do that. It just vitiates every rule of grammar imaginable. No, of pronunciation. So, would you sit down?
Isn't there a rule about how many Preuses can be in a room?
I hope not.
It's a German-made rule.
Exactly. Only a German would think of that rule, yeah. So, okay, so Dr. Weinstein, besides his utter hatred for Christianity, was also just rather pompous, but he's told us that he knew all these languages, including German and Latin. And one time I was, by the way, this is the same guy who placed Martin Luther in the 13th century and Augustine in the 8th. So he was the one who proved to me that just because you have a PhD doesn't mean you know anything, right? Which is a very valuable lesson for a 19-year-old to learn, right? And I am reading some philosophical work in his class, and I raised my hand and I asked him about this footnote, because it said, like demonstratum est, and I thought it should say demonstrandum est, right? So I was going to ask him about this. And he looks at it, and he read it, and he says, I really do have to beef up on my German. Now, this guy said he knew Latin. And I think he actually thought he did, because he probably took a Latin class. And that's our definition now of knowing a language. I think we've all run into this, haven't we? So you talk to some person, and they say, oh yeah, I know Spanish. Oh really, can you translate that sign for me? No, of course they can't. But they took 2 years in high school, right? And maybe some of you are guilty of saying something like that, right? I don't know. This is the expectation now. This is what it means to learn a language, right? It's to take a couple of years. You don't ever actually learn it. And I think that this is something that we have to rid ourselves of in classical education. It almost seems to me that it would be better not to teach Latin than to teach just a little bit so that we can say we gave them a little bit of Latin, and then they go off and say, oh yeah, I know Latin, and yet they have never read any real Latin ever. Well, what's the point? What we like to say is, oh well, the point is to get them so they have a better English vocabulary, right? Or they understand grammar better or whatever. In other words, we have goals outside of actually learning Latin. And we have to refocus and say, no, our goal is that our children learn Latin, that they actually know it, that they can read it, that they can pick up Cicero without a dictionary and read the first Catilinarian oration, right? and enjoy it. All right? And you know what? They can. At least some of them can. Right? They can. So my first point is that we need a goal. And that goal should be that our 8th graders are reading Latin. Reading it. Cicero, Caesar, Virgil, reading it. Okay? That means that our curriculum can't just include Latin. Latin has to be an integral part of it. And so what's the objection? The objection is, in order to get them to learn Latin, to be this good at Latin, we're going to have to put so much time into teaching Latin. We don't have that time, right? We're talking 40, 50 minutes a day, which is exactly what I'm proposing, 40 or 50 minutes a day of Latin, right? Starting in 3rd grade. Well, what about, and we'll do K through 2 also when we talk about our, the curriculum that I'm suggesting. But what about all the other subjects, right? What about time for history? What about time for grammar? What about time for, what else do we have? Rhetoric, math, so forth. Well, if they're actually reading Latin in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, then they're getting their history. They can read the Gallic Wars in Latin. How's that? All right? These selections of them, you can fill in the rest, right? So if we actually integrate our curriculum so that Latin is a part of it, and Latin will actually teach them grammar, Latin will actually teach them history, Latin will actually teach them, it can be their literature class, right? And I think we need to start thinking this way, that Latin is that important, second only to the Word of God, Mark would say, and music, right? But I include music in the Word of God, because you should be singing hymns. Right? And learning to play them on the violin and the piano. But you can also sing in Latin. Yeah, there we go. There's a good compromise. So, Mark, I'm glad you're here, Pastor Preus, because I just did this. So sorry if I'm tired, because I just did this exact. They gave me it 2 times in a row. Now, anybody, do you ever have to teach a college class the same one twice in a row?
I never have to, but instructors frequently do.
Yeah, it's not fun.
Yeah, sometimes 3 times.
Yeah, yeah. And then you think you have to change stuff because it's not interesting, right?
You let Julius Caesar live the second time.
Yeah. Anyhow, I love to play cornhole. Everybody know what cornhole is? It's my favorite game now. And it's basically because you don't have to exert any physical. But I play it a lot, and I've noticed that the more I play it, the better I get. And then the more I play it, and the better I get, the more I love it. Does that ever happen with you, with anything? Of course it does. That's the way it works, right? If you don't put the time in, you're not going to get good, and you're not going to like it. And this is exactly the way it is with Latin. We think, oh, don't overbear them and give them too much of this. This is hard stuff. No. Give them a lot of Latin. Give them 40 minutes a day, 50 minutes a day. Make it a priority, and then they'll start to love it. The kid who goes through Latin slowly, the kid who only learns it once or twice a week, hates it because he doesn't understand it and he doesn't progress, right? And so it makes Latin a miserable chore for him. And that's not what we want. But if he gets good by spending a lot of time on it, he's going to love it, and then you see the happiness as he progresses.
Just to clarify, are you talking 40 minutes during school time, or is that also included homework?
Okay, yes, so during school time, yes, during school time, and I would minimize homework. Anybody know why I would minimize homework? Yeah.
Because
Parents can't help them. Parents don't know Latin.
And if they do help them, you'll have to reteach it the next day anyway.
Yeah, yeah. So if I would recommend 40, 50 minutes a day in class and minimize homework to memorizing vocab, because that's something that the parents can actually help them with, though they might mispronounce the words too. But you can give them YouTube videos of how to pronounce words, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's the reason. And what I did in teaching college or teaching grade school is I started out every day with vocab, and I would have vocab cards about this size, and I would go through the vocab for the chapter for that day, and the whole class would say it with me. So even then, even if they're not learning the vocab at home, they'll learn it during class. And then I would do it if I had time at the end of class also. And you do it both ways, English to Latin, Latin to English. And as you progress through the chapters, you review other chapters also. Yep.
I'd like your opinion on this. When I've taught Greek or Latin, I've told the students not only to drill vocab, but also to drill the paradigms, conjugations, declensions, and principal parts, and that sort of thing, practice parsing. So what do you suggest for drills?
Yeah, so yeah, you want to drill the basic endings, but sometimes that can be, it depends on where you're at in the class. I mean, I would want by 6th, 7th grade them to know those so well because they've had them since kindergarten.
Yeah.
So my kids right now, I mean, the kids who came from me, those ones are 7. My oldest are 7 years and 8 years, and they can give you, they can sing out OST, mus tissant, or mus tissant, yeah, and bombas ba, bombas badas bonds, and I, and so forth. And it's because they actually did classical conversations, and they had to do all those things, and we just continued doing them. And so my teachers, do I have my teachers in? None of my teachers are in here.
I told them that they
Oh, yes, you are. Yeah. No, but yeah, but you can do this too, right? Just simply say I, is, is, and the kids just memorize it, they soak it in. So they already know these paradigms by the time they're in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. But yeah, they need reviewing. But we'll get into that when I talk about the actual curriculum and my tiered system that I'm setting up at Mount Hope. Any other questions? Okay, so that's the first thing, is establishing a goal. Establishing a goal and realizing that that goal takes a lot of time to make the time commitment. The goal is, again, that the kid learns Latin, actually learns it, so that when someone says, do you know Latin, he can say yes. And to prove it, he can pick up some Cicero and translate it. Right? If that's our goal, then that means a whole lot, and we're going to get into what that means. First of all, if our goal is that they can actually read Latin, that means we need to teach them grammar, the actual grammar of the language. Now, I've seen a lot of textbooks. There's there are a lot of Latin textbooks. Everyone's got their grand idea, right? How to teach Latin best. A lot of them will, especially for the younger grades, be unbelievably heavy on etymologies and on history and on culture. So you learn what's in the kitchen of your typical Roman villa, right? But you don't learn much grammar at all. There's one textbook that I saw, and I'm not naming any names here. First of all, because I can't remember the name of the textbook. And second, because it's common to all sorts of textbooks. And if you see this, you should run like the plague or change your curriculum away from this. Where it'll introduce one tiny little grammar section, right? And then all the rest of the chapter is etymologies. So what comes from nauta? Ooh, nautical. Well, a monkey can learn that. And it's not teaching them Latin at all, right? Teaching them etymologies isn't teaching them Latin. And then by the time you have three pages after this one tiny little grammatical point, they've forgotten the grammatical point. And then you move on, and they consider it completely boring. And then you have 3 years of this, say 3rd through 5th grade, 3 years of this. And then you have to start them on Wheelock's chapter 1. In other words, they've had 3 years of Latin and haven't learned a thing. All right. there's just no reason to do it. No reason at all. If you have to, after 3 years of teaching Latin, start with a basic elementary textbook in 6th grade where they're learning laudo, laudas, laudat for the first time, basically, then you've wasted 3 years. Or you can just call it what it is and say, we're teaching Roman culture. We're teaching Latin etymologies, right? So but don't say you're teaching Latin if all you're doing is teaching etymologies and culture. That make sense? And so again, if our goal is to get them to learn Latin, then we're going to teach them grammar starting in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, actual grammar, right? I would often have, when I taught Latin at the college level, I would have kids come in and they'd say, well, I want to be a nurse. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a lawyer. And my advisor told me to take Latin because this will help me with terminology. To which I should have responded if I didn't need the numbers, right? Because I need the numbers. Otherwise, they shut down my class. I should have responded, then go take a medical terminology class or a legal terminology class because you're going to learn grammar here, and you might learn 5 words that are going to apply to your legal terminology. And besides that, the legal terminology pronounces it all wrong, right? An amicus brief, what's that? It's an amicus brief, right? It's just insane. I remember listening to the Senate hearings for Judge Alito, where they asked him what he thought about Roe v. Wade, and he said, I believe in stare decisis. And I was like, well, that's got to be Latin, but that is definitely not how you pronounce stare decisis, right? I think it's stare decisis, right? To stand with what has been decided, right? I'm assuming, is that right? Yeah, all right. But in other words, they pronounce everything wrong in legal terminology, and you can take one class in law school called legal terminology, and you'll learn all those, and you don't need to learn Latin at all, right? So again, this has to do with the goal. What is the goal? The goal of taking Latin is to know Latin, to read Latin, to get to the point where you're reading Cicero without a dictionary and having a good time doing it. Not for all these other things of increasing my vocab. That'll come, it will. Increasing my logic abilities, increasing whatever other ulterior benefits Latin has, right? But just for the joy of learning the language, that has to be the goal. Did you have something?
We call that mastery.
Yeah. I started learning Latin by myself because I just really wanted to learn it, and I didn't have any chance of going to a classical school. They didn't exist where we lived and when I was a boy, right? So I started learning it by myself because my brother Mark was taking it in college, and I thought this would be great. Then I go to college, and the first thing the professor says is, I'm not here to make you scholars in Latin, at which my heart sank, and I dropped his class. And then I just learned it by myself. Why not become a scholar of Latin? That's the point. Learn it, right? Because you won't love it unless you learn it. And to be able to read the Aeneid, this is what I told my my students. I'd say, this is what you should imagine. In 40 years, this is where you want to be. In your backyard, in the summer, on your deck, sipping a pink lemonade and reading Virgil in Latin. And it's my job to make it so that that is your goal. Right? You love Latin that much. And I think some of them probably do. The last girl I had that was really good at Latin in college, she was an LCMS girl, and she went to Harvard. She was ridiculously smart. It's so fun to have that. All right, anyway. Latin is not a means to an end. Once we start treating it that way, especially if we treat it that way from the very beginning, it just saps all the excitement out of the kids, right? And they don't actually learn the language. Okay, the third element. So we have the goal, we have the means, that is teaching grammar, and the third element is you teach grammar with speed, alacrity, all right? Going slowly through Latin makes learning Latin miserable. It saps excitement. It gives the kids no sense of accomplishment, of actually progressing with the goal of reading the stuff. And so you will need to stop and take more time with certain difficult concepts, but to stall a kid and make him wait and wait and wait and wait because you're studying some cultural thing or historical thing, learning what's in a kitchen, that is just going to sap his excitement. He wants to go further and learn, right? Or if you're holding them back because of the other kids in the class. Well, they haven't gotten this far, Charlie, so you got to wait another week and a half. Then Charlie's never going to learn, and he's going to hate it. He needs to be able to progress as soon as he knows the material well enough to progress. Now, what do you do with those who can't keep up? That's the question. All right. So what do you do in a public school system with those who can't keep up?
Pass them any-
What's that?
pass them any-
You pass them anyhow, or you make it so that those who are advanced, you just bring them down to the level of everyone else, and you teach to the lowest common denominator. That's just the way it works. Because otherwise it wouldn't be fair to little Billy, because Billy's not as smart as Charlie. So we have to democratize it, right, and make them equal. C.S. Lewis wrote a wonderful article on this. I think it's called The Democratization of Education. We were going to put it on our website for Mount Hope, but I decided against it because it calls unintelligent kids dunces, and I thought that might hurt people's feelings. And we are a church first and then a school, right? But C.S. Lewis's point was for the people he calls dunces, right? So those who can't make it quite can't learn Latin quite as fast or any other subject quite as fast. He says it's good for them. It's good for them to see other people advance above them. They learn they learn their place, and they might be able to beat that kid up on the playground, or beat him at basketball or whatever, right? And they can take some pride in that. But it's good for a student to learn that Charlie's smarter. All right, Charlie's got a different place in life than he does. What's the big deal about that, right? Since when do we have to just say everyone's equal? Everyone's not equal. Some people are better at some things than others, right? And you encourage a kid to know his place, right? So that's one thing, and I'd actually recommend that you read that. It might tick you off, especially when he calls unintelligent kids dunces, but read it a few times and translate dunces as less gifted individuals intellectually, and just let it sink in that it is good for the smart kids and for the less smart kids if you go at the smart kids' pace. Okay? Now, I realize that will cause problems, especially with parents, right? And especially if you're dealing with grades, right? So you mentioned the grades. You start giving Fs out to kids who can't keep up with Charlie. That's a huge problem. Yes?
You may be saying to address this. Your thoughts on placement for students who are coming in to our schools at a later point?
That's exactly what I'm going to address right now. For those who are coming in at a later point, or those who, we'll just call Jimmy the dumb one and Charlie the smart one. So those who are like Jimmy.
I like when you make Charlie the smart one.
Why is that, Charlie? All right, I've basically got, and by the way, I haven't even done this yet. We're just setting it up for next year. But I had it as a goal for my child, my son David, and my daughter Christine, my son Abraham, who are going to be 3rd, 2nd, 1st grade, right? That they all are reading Cicero by 8th grade. That way they can move on to read Plato by 11th grade, right? And then whatever after that, right? So I came up, I thought that this should also, if I got this goal for my own children, I should certainly have it for the children in my school, right? And it could be that some of my children, and I'm again talking about my own children, won't be able to make it to read Cicero in 8th grade. And that's fine, right? I hope they all can, but maybe they can't, right? In which case, we have to have a program in place where they can still be learning Latin and not keeping the other kids back. All right? So I got basically 5 tiers here. Why did I write 5? Because I said 5, that's right. All right. All right. And I'm going to give you the textbooks that I'm going to be using. That doesn't mean you have to use them. I would just simply say you pick grammar-based textbooks. If you don't pick grammar-based textbooks, then your goal is not to read Latin, or not to teach Latin. It's something else, right? And I would ask you to call it something else then, because you're not teaching Latin. Number 1, this would be K through 2nd grade. And this is simply memorizing endings, going through vocab. I would pick the most common 150 vocab words of nouns and verbs, right? And then go through the first 3 declensions, the endings, right? So you're talking I, right? And I, is, as, is. All right, so these kids should know that, should know how they're spelled, know where the macrons go, and everything, right? But especially just the oral repetition of these. Say it with me. Is, as, is. All right, and then going to the second declension, us, o, is, os, is. All right, you can all do this, right?
Yep.
All right, if not, do it. All right, learn it. Us, o, is, os, is. All right, and then go to the third declension, right, and just start with an X for the nominative because you don't know what the nominative is going to be. X, is, ace, ibis, ace, ibis. Okay, so those 3 declensions should be being drilled K through 2nd grade. All these verb forms here. See, this doesn't have 3rd declension. We should really add the 3rd declension here. And then, but yeah, all these verb forms here. So those are the verb endings. These can all be memorized, and little kids don't think it's boring. Put it in a chant form; they love it. And then, starting in 1st grade, you start teaching them a little bit of what these mean. Give them the terminology of nominative, genitive, and so forth. And you don't need any book for this. You just give it to them so they know the basics, right? What is the nominative? It is the subject, right? And you can correct any simplifications that you're making. What is the genitive? Of. What is the dative? To, for. What is the accusative? Direct object. I don't know what a direct object is. I don't care. It's a direct object. You'll learn when Pastor Preus teaches you in 3rd grade. And then ablative, what's that? From, by, with. Just throw a bunch of prepositions in, right? Just so they start learning these basic things, and they start learning the terminology. Okay. Along with that, you can do the silly games if you want of head, shoulders. How does it go? Head, shoulders, knees and toes. Yeah, as if those are the most common Latin words. But otherwise, you can do like a Latin vocab game. Just have the kids compete, especially the boys. Boys must compete with each other. They love to, right? So a simple Latin vocab game is, hey, Jimmy, say a Latin word. And then Charlie says one. And then Jimmy says one. And they just try to beat each other. The first one who can't say a Latin word loses.
That's great.
And the one who ends up, saying, kiwis. And then that's it. All right, good. He won. All right, you give him a gold star. You put a gold star. You tell him to pretend that it's gold. All right? But have them compete like that. And you could even do, if you have enough board space, do board games where they actually write out the words, right? Simple vocab. I don't know how beneficial it is to actually talk Latin to the little kids, except for to give them vocab, because you're inevitably going to start simplifying things, saying things like puella est pulchra. And then that gives them the impression that Latin's always going to be this equals this, right? That means the girl is beautiful, by the way. Right. You all knew that, though, right? Yes. Yeah. You knew it.
Which
Great.
school are we talking about?
Mea uxor.
Yeah.
Uxor mihi. All right. Oh, I just did the first tier here. Yeah, so that's there. What we're going to do in 3rd grade is we're going to have Linny's. Anybody know Linny's? No? It's a homeschool book, getting started with Latin. It's 100% grammatical. That's why I love it. None of this culture stuff or history stuff. I'm not belittling that, by the way. They're going to learn all sorts of history and culture when they learn the language, right? And you can add a little bit here and there, but never let it dominate. That's not teaching Latin. That's teaching Latin culture. And they'll get that much better once they actually know the language and they can read it for themselves. So Linny's getting started with Latin. There's like 130 lessons in there. They start it really simple. You just do them day by day with the kid. And by the end of that, they're basically through, when I say Wheelock is the standard, has been the standard textbook for college elementary Latin for I don't know how many years, 60, 70 years. All right, so Wheelock, when I say Wheelock, I'm simply saying the standard textbook for getting through the basic grammar in a year. All right? Wheelock has 40 chapters, and it gets you through elementary Latin in a year. Linny's will get you through basically the first 5 chapters of Wheelock. That's substantial, right? But it does piece by piece, all right? Maybe the first 4 chapters. 4th through 5th grade, then, we would graduate to Jenny's, which again is a totally grammatical approach. It's like Wheelock, except for it's for kids. One of the great benefits of Jenny's is that it has a constant story running through, so you actually go through the story of the Aeneid. With Aeneas narrating most of it as you go through Jenny's 1. And so you get this consistent story as you go chapter to chapter. It reviews after every four chapters. It's very easy to teach, and it goes at a nice pace. And then Jenny's also has, so this is Jenny's 1. Then you have Jenny's 2. Jenny's 1 gets you to basically everything except for indirect statements and everything subjunctive. All right? So Jenny's 2 introduces indirect statements and everything subjunctive, and then it gets you straight into Latin prose. So by the end of Jenny's 2, your 6th graders are reading the Bellum Gallicum, Caesar's Gallic Wars, real Latin with notes. Okay? And then the 5th tier, 7th through 8th grade, you would be doing things like whatever you want. Cicero, the Catilinarian orations, Caesar's Civil War, which I think is better than his Gallic War by far. It's just much more fun to read. What else do we have that you could introduce, especially a prose? You could do Church Fathers. Augustine's pretty easy, or Augustine. I say Augustine. How many people say Augustine? Huh? It is, Augustinus, yeah. All right. Augustine is how most people say it, I guess. I broke from you in that. You say Augustine, don't you?
You did. You broke.
That was arrogance on my part.
That's all right.
Hashtag arrogance, yeah. All right. If you like, you can actually do Jenny's 3 if you want to keep with the Jenny's theme, because that has Latin prose. It's devoted to Latin prose, and it's got good notes and so forth. All right, so what happens if a 6th grader comes in, knows no Latin? Well, if you think that the 6th grader is pretty smart, you start him right there with Jenny's 1, right? If you think that he's going to need some more help, you start him right there with the 3rd graders in Linny's, right? What happens when the 3rd grader just can't figure out anything in Linny's? You keep him there until he's in 8th grade or until he learns, and he can graduate from Linny's. What happens when the 5th grader can't get through Jenny's 1? You keep him in Jenny's 1, or if he's holding other kids back, you put him back into Linny's, so forth and so on. So you have a tiered system. You teach them all at the same time if you can, right? Or you make it so that you can shuffle kids. That's what you'd have to do with this sort of a curriculum. All right. Obviously, that's not going to apply to homeschoolers because homeschoolers, you can shuffle them anytime you want. Yep.
Okay, so you would have all of your classes taking Latin on campus at the exact same time, so they can move to a different way?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Unless you can work it out a different way. Right.
Are any of those a curriculum that you would let a student self-teach? Or
Yes.
you need to
Yeah.
have-
You're going to have to be creative with that. So, for instance, we're going to have 2 kids on at this level next year, and I'm going to have to let them self-teach for, but they're going to get the 50 minutes, and I'm going to give them the kind of homework, and they're going to be able to do it because I know the kids.
And what are you going to be doing at that time?
Teaching somebody else.
At a lower level?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. But I would devote 50 minutes to them on like a Monday, and then give them enough homework to go the rest of the week. Yeah. And especially with the older levels, that's an easier thing to do because they should be able to translate and then come to my office if they need help or whatever. So they're more independent. And obviously, ideally, you wouldn't have to do anything like that, but because you have enough teachers. Yep.
How would you
Yeah, that's the next thing. Grading and tests. I don't like either. All right? I don't like grading. So we have to keep the goal constantly in mind. The goal is not to get an A. The goal is to learn Latin. What happens when you make the goal getting an A, and especially for the parents, what do the parents want? They want to see that A, right? They want to see this progress. Well, then you start writing tests like this. So conjugate sum esse. All right, 6 points. Right, in the present, there's 6 points. All right. Define, 12 points. All right, so then you got 12 vocab, easy points. Right, especially when you just put like nauta, right? They all know it's sailor, okay? 10 points. Give a description of a Roman villa. Okay, that's culture. So far you have really easy, really easy. The only thing the grammatical is 6 points, and you've got 28 total points. You can get all of that wrong and still, in other words, you don't need to know Latin at all to pass this test, right? And then you're going to have 8 points for derivations, right? So give the derivations for these words. Nauta equals nautical, puer equals puerile, whatever. Again, not learning Latin. You see, that's what ends up happening. And then the kids score high in these quizzes, but the goal has been completely forgotten because the goal became getting an A. And then the teacher wants the student to get an A because then he looks good, and the parents are happy, and the student's happy, and so forth, except for no one learns Latin, right? So if you're going to have tests, I don't see the point for most tests because a test should be to measure where someone is at. And how do you measure where someone's at learning Latin? Can he read it? You can do it right in class. Right? Can you read this? Can you tell me what case that is? Can you and if you're going to do a test, then those are the questions you should be asking. Translate this, tell me what case that is, tell me what construction this is, and so forth. Right? Not all this culture stuff. Because that will dominate, and then they won't. They'll think that that's the important part of it, and it's not yet. They'll learn the culture once they know the language. Okay.
Quick question.
Yep.
If I can interrupt. Do you present this, I'm guessing, to all the parents before, say, look, I know all y'all want to see A's, but the goal is to learn Latin, essentially just have that conversation with them, so we're knocking on the door later.
Yeah, so I didn't get to the grading part, and that's a good question. So I would recommend getting rid of grades for Latin, getting rid of it, except for a satisfactory and an unsatisfactory. And that's completely based on whether they do work, whether they are trying at all. They might not be smart enough to learn Latin, let's just face that, right? And if they're not, you drop them back, and if they're trying hard in Lenny's, they're trying hard in Lenny's, that's fine, right? And they get a satisfactory. The only goal is that they learn Latin, that those who can learn Latin. So whether they get a satisfactory or an A doesn't matter, because and I think that the parents will be, the situation will be ameliorated simply by you saying, all we're doing is satisfactory for Latin. I mean, I don't think it'll anger too many people that you're not giving grades out. What'll anger them is if you give their kid an F. Right? Yeah.
Are there some books that you can use with younger children at lower levels that have little paragraphs or passages from the Bible or other areas where that they could read knowing a lower level of Latin? I think that would be really fun for them to be able to translate at a lower level.
I don't know, actually. I'm sure there are. Anybody know?
Sox and Cambridge have books for kids that are simple and basic grammar. One is called Mini Moose.
Yeah.
They're not biblical.
Not biblical, yeah. Yeah.
I could
They're ancient.
But, yeah, right.
Try the small catechism.
That grammar.
Small catechism in Latin? Yeah.
And not necessarily Luther's explanations, but your first commandment.
Yeah, your first commandment. So that's the Bible right there.
I didn't hear what they said over there.
Oh, there's like Winnie the Pooh books and things like that. Yeah.
There's Prima Latina from Memoria Press. It doesn't do much translation, but they're learning vocabulary. But they're doing memorization. Like they memorize the Lord's Prayer,
Sure.
the Sanctus, the Gloria Patri.
Yeah.
So they're learning some Latin by memorization.
Yeah. And that's for early grades, like before third grade. Yeah.
I taught 4th, 5th, and 6th grade Latin this past year at a classical Christian academy in St. Louis, and the curriculum they use there is, I think it's called Latin for Children. I think the publisher is called Classical Academic Press, and it does a good job with the grammar. They also get derivatives and like a page at the end of each chapter on Roman culture, but it really, they have to learn the conjugations and the endings. There's also a supplementary workbook you can do with it, and there's a reader that goes along with it.
Yeah.
They have a primer A, B, and C.
Yeah. So I'm not at all saying these are the textbooks you have to use. I'm simply saying use a textbook that focuses on grammar and actually gets through the grammar with the goal of being able to read at the end of it.
And there are tests.
And there are certain textbooks that simply do not do that.
Yeah.
The goal is simply not to get the student to be able to learn to be able to read Latin. Jenny's also has each chapter starts with the culture thing, but you can cover that in 25 minutes or so. Yeah.
There's a thing that's technically called embedded reading, which is where you say, gee, I'd really like to read Jacob and Esau. So you go to the Vulgate, you pull out Jacob and Esau, but then you just take out all the hard words and put in an easy word, or I don't know the gerundive yet, so you just sort of make it easy
Yeah.
for their level, and then you don't have to buy anything.
Yeah. If you're able to do, I mean, obviously you're able to do that.
Well,
Most of our teachers probably wouldn't be able to, but it would be a good
well, if you
practice
say-
to start.
Well, if you're a teacher and you say, I don't understand this, just cross it out.
Yeah, yeah, good point. Well, and that actually gets to the last point I was going to make, and that is that a teacher needs to learn Latin. You have to learn Latin. And it's like, but you can't expect, if your goal is for your students to learn Latin so that they can actually read it, it makes no sense for you to be teaching it when you don't know it. Those are the facts. And it's tough for us because this got thrown, it's not tough for me, I'm sorry, but it's tough for some of you older folks because this got, or those of you who just, didn't happen to go to grad school for Latin and Greek, but because you didn't get this when you were children, right? And so you're having to learn it when you're older, and I understand that. But at the same time, you need to be, you need to have the excitement that comes with knowing the language. And
Could I mention that
CCLE offers Latin classes.
CCLE offers now Wittenberg Academy offers Latin for children. CCLE offers a Latin online course for adults. And
Yeah.
I do the Greek one for adults for CCLE.
So they won't have to have you for the Latin class.
No, I think Joanna Hensley has done this.
Okay, all right,
And somebody else.
good. Yes?
What's your opinion of the teaching of Christian Latin as opposed to classical Latin?
I think it's a bad idea.
Why do you say it's a bad idea?
Because the Reformation, I mean, you can't even read Melanchthon. You're going to have trouble reading the Confessions of the Lutheran Church. You're certainly going to have trouble reading just all sorts of ecclesiastical Latin post Reformation if you don't know classical. And you will have zero problem reading ecclesiastical Latin if you just learn the classical. So the Reformation was, and the invigoration of classical education, that was a return to authors like Cicero and Caesar to clean up Latin. I once did an experiment. I was asked to translate this Italian friar from the 14th century. It was disgusting, terrible. The Latin was just, he didn't say anything disgusting. That's not what I meant. The Latin, just infinitives all over the place, anarchy of language. I did not know what it said. And so I had to make notes, this could be a purpose clause, or he could just have forgotten to conjugate this infinitive. I don't know what's going on here. And then you contrast that with someone like Martin Chemnitz, who is just beautiful Latin. And you know why he has beautiful Latin? Because he read Cicero. And I can understand everything Chemnitz writes. There's no problem with it because he follows the grammar. Yeah. And as far as pronunciation goes, pronunciation for ecclesiastical Latin is inconsistent because it depends on the region in which you speak it. Italian ecclesiastical Latin pronunciation is different from German because they pronounce their syllables different. So, for example, you got this, loci theologici, right? So, that loci, I've heard that pronounced lotzi, I've heard it pronounced lotsai, loci, lochai, lochi, it's just all sorts of different things. Just go with the classical, loci. Then everyone's saying the same thing. Right? Yes.
So when you're talking about how much time you carve out in a week, this 40 to 50 minutes a day, you're assuming a fair amount of that time is, especially without a lot of homework given, time devoted to student work versus just purely instruction.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Where the teacher would be, helping out with kids who are having struggling with translation or whatever, and heavily translation, right? Yeah.
If I might offer a word of encouragement to adults learning, you go verify this, but I've got a friend who's one of the leading, most respected Spanish teachers in the country, and kind of on the cutting edge of second language acquisition, contracted out to the U.S. military, stuff like this. They're seeing, in latest research, according to him, they're seeing that it's not really true that children learn language faster than adults. What children will learn better, more intuitively, is accent and pronunciation. But a 90-year-old studying Latin can learn it just as well as a 15-year-old. Why we usually think that children learn faster is because they get the time. Mm-hmm. They get the 50 minutes a day. Adults have trouble carving out 50 minutes a day.
Yeah.
So if you're doing the 50 minutes with your kids, if you put the time in, don't think, well, I can't learn Latin because I'm not 16 years old.
Yeah.
You can.
Yeah.
You really can.
Yeah, it's become a common excuse, hasn't it?
Yeah, you really can do it. You have a human brain. It's a human language. There's no
Yeah.
problem.
How important are the accent marks? Sorry.
That's a good question. So obviously, when it comes to the nominative and the ablative in the first declension, they have to know that accent mark because otherwise they're going to confuse these.
I tell the students, I'll mark you wrong if you don't put that macron
Yeah.
over the ablative.
Yeah.
And then
And then I would also insist in the plural dative and ablative ending for first and second declension that you say is, never let them say is, because then they're going to eventually get it very confused with the genitive ending, singular genitive ending to the third declension. So those are the only ones, though, that, there might be a couple others where it's really important. As far as actually putting the macrons, Latin doesn't have accents in the original, right? So pronunciation is more important than actually putting macrons on. But the macrons are obviously there to help you with the pronunciation. And where it really matters, I mean, you'll see where it really matters if they're being confused because, yeah, and it definitely matters in poetry. Yeah, yeah.
The
And
macron or the pronunciation matters in poetry.
the pronunciation, which goes along with the macron. I mean, the macron is a tool to tell you when it's long and short. That's it. Yeah. Yep.
So, Emmanuel Press came out with a hymnal, Evangelical Lutheran Latin hymnal, I think it's called. And it has, all the hymns in it are, they both have an English and a Latin translation. What are your thoughts about incorporating, Latin hymn singing in your chapel line or something like that?
Yeah, that sounds great as long as it doesn't replace the actual instruction on grammar. So again, it can't be, okay, we're going to stop teaching Latin for a couple of weeks so you can memorize this hymn. Because memorizing that hymn, anyone can do who doesn't know Latin, right? Pirates do that all the time, right? So it's not actually progressing them in Latin. But if you make it so that, it's in music class that you're doing that, and then maybe take one Latin class to show them how it actually fits together, depending on where they are in Latin, whether they can understand it. Yeah. That makes sense? So nothing to actually replace grammatical instruction. All right. I think we're out of time, aren't we? All right. Thank you very much.